wonderful to see you all. I've never done this before, so you'll have to keep me on track if I disappear from view or something. But in preparing for this event, it took me on a journey back to my beginnings in this endeavor we call queer archiving. I want to bring into the room, and I do this all the time, some of my comrades and friends who made all this possible so many years ago. So it's a line of names, but much more than that, of shared passion. So Jonathan Ned Katz, Liz Kennedy, Madeline Davis, John D'Amelio, Judith Swartz, Deborah Adel, Gail Rubin, the San Francisco Gay History Oral Project on the West Coast, and LHA on the East, and above all, Alan Barabee, who died much too soon, who helped all our work, made all our work possible. This is what I wrote in 1998. I've been lucky enough in my own life to have participated in the beginning moments of a people's movement from private history, and in many cases a history touched by shame, to valued public discourse. I remember the early meetings in Boston, New York, Maine, San Francisco, Toronto, Amsterdam, where a handful of women and men gathered to share their discoveries and to agonize over how to find the time and money to continue their work, how best to share their discoveries with the communities they were documenting, and how to balance the need for anonymity, a survival tactic of our people for so long, against the delight of revelation. I remember the flickering slideshows capturing the lost faces and communal streets of other gay times, and the stunned recognition of audiences that were meeting for the first time their own public story. In those days, we were not always sure that this fledgling idea of lesbian and gay history would find a home in the world. And of course, now, how many years later, we know it has. We're not sure what it all means, but we know it has. Thank you all for making this meeting possible. If there are some in the hall whom I have met over the years, I greet you. Is there anyone there that I have met over the years? That's okay, I'm meeting you now, so that's okay. And others, thank you for spending some of your festival time with this 74-year-old femme lesbian who came out in the working class lesbian bars of New York City in 1958. And you did have a chance to see some of the images, right, of my time. That was my answer when, am I doing okay, Carl?
Yeah.
Okay. When Carl said, why did you do this work? And I thought those images could answer that question in a profound way. I have asked Carl to share with as many of you as possible my essay on the archives, and he has that on he can make that available if you want, The Will to Remember. So you would have some sense of my personal, political, and conceptual journey that led me particularly to join with others in the creation of a grassroots lesbian archives in 1974. I wanted to make this journey known to you, as many of you as possible, so other conversations could happen and I could learn from your questions, your insights, and I really look forward to our question time. I am open to all questions, from the most practical of how we picked up mail in those days to questionings of sanity. I also have sent Carl some images from the last public talk I gave, the one I predicted would be my last, and when you're in your 70s, sometimes you'll want to do this kind of thing, make predictions. It was called The Bodies I Have Lived With, and it was at the 2011 Lesbian Lives Conference in Brighton, to start to answer why I gave so many years of my life to this project. The bodies, the faces, the stories that so touched me on every level. The historical, the political, the poetic, the sexual. My archival self has been formed by my experience of degradation, sexual exuberance, and the dignity of resistance in the Greenwich Village police bars of the 50s. by my reading Frantz Fanon and Albert Memmi in the mid-60s, when I started teaching students from colonized backgrounds in the first open enrollment program of the City University of New York, by my involvement in the American civil rights, anti-war, women's, and gay liberation movements. And even before, I learned the life-giving existence of counter-narratives to the nationally assumed, and joining other young people in confronting the fear-mongering politics of Joseph McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee in the mid-50s. And I want to say here, I realize this is so American-centric, you know, and I hope it will have some meaning. These were passions of one kind, but the other, just as compelling, was my desire to say thank you to the women who brought my desire to life so many years ago in pre-gay liberation America. How do you archive touch and the courage of those who risked so much in offering it? Now, Carl had asked me to give a lecture, but I'm really not a lecturer. I'm a collagist, is what I'd say. So you're going to hear a variety of voices that I've carried with me all these years in so many places. This is a reading for Albert Memmi, the author of The Colonizer and the Colonized, one of the things that prodded me in my work, and he wrote it in 1967. The colonized draws less and less from their past. The colonizer never even recognized that they had one. Everyone knows that the commoner whose origins are unknown has no history. Let us ask the colonized herself, who are her folk heroes? And here you know I changed the pronoun. It was his, but let us ask the colonized herself, who are her folk heroes, her great popular leaders, her sages. At most, she may be able to give us a few names in complete disarray, and fewer as one goes down the generations. The colonized seems condemned to lose her memory. And that, for me, was one of the pressing insights that determined I would give the majority of my adult life to this project. In a more concrete way, I want to share an experience that is behind all my work with the archives and the generation I was trying to honor. This is from a piece I wrote called The Bathroom Line, and it's based in a bar I went to, a working class bar called the Sea Colony, which was an ironic, I didn't realize the connection then. The most searing reminder of our colonized world was the bathroom line. I wrote this in 1981. Now I know it stands for all the pain and glory of my time, and I carry that line and the women who endured it deep within me. And I wanted you to see those images because you saw now women who are on that line. Because we were labeled deviants, our bathroom habits had to be watched. Only one woman at a time was allowed into the toilet because we could not be trusted. Thus the toilet line was born, a twisting horizon of lesbian women waiting for permission to urinate, shit. The line flowed past the far wall, past the bar, the front room tables, and reached into the back room. Guarding the entrance to the toilet was a short, square, handsome butch woman, the same one every night, whose job it was to wrap around her fist our allotted amount of toilet paper. She was us in obscurity, doing the man's tricks so we could breathe. The line awaited all of us every night, and we developed a line act. We joked, we cruised, we commented on the length of time one of us took. We made special pleas to allow hot and heavy lovers in together, knowing that Our Lady would not permit it. I stood a femme, loving the women on either side of me, loving my comrades for their style, the power of their stance, the hair hitting the collar, the thrown-out hip, the hand encircling the beer can. Our eyes played the line, subtle touches, gentle shyness weaved under the boring jokes, music, the surveillance. We lived on that line, restricted and judged. We took deep breaths and played. But buried deep in our endurance was our fury. That line with practice and theory seared into one. We wove our freedoms, our culture, around their obstacles of hatred, but we also paid our price. Every time I took the fistful of toilet paper, I swore eventual liberation. It would be, however, liberation with a memory. Another voice from that time, a working-class butch lesbian of the 1950s, and all of these are in the archives. Things back then were terrible, and I think because I fought like a man to survive, I made it somehow easier for the kids coming out today. I did all their fighting for them. I'm not a rich person. She's talking about her life in the 50s. I would have nothing to leave nobody in this world, but I have that I can leave to the kids who are coming out now, who will come out in the future. That I left them a better place to come out into, and that's all I have to offer, to leave them. But I wouldn't deny it, even though I was getting my brains beaten up. I would never stand up and say, no, don't hit me, I'm not gay, I wouldn't do that. Now comes another layer of history. Lesbian feminism enters my life in the 70s and makes the archives possible. So I could, in a way, I was trying to rescue my old communities from new judgments. Now, I'm going to ask Carl to start showing you the images of the archives and its growth. And I'm reading from the archive's first newsletter. I want to show you what it looked like. Can you see me okay? Is everything okay? You see, so this is what the first archives newsletter looked like. You see, it's how simple its technology is. That's life was in 1974. So here we go. From newsletter number 1 of the Lesbian Herstory Archives, June 1975. We are a group of women who met initially at the first conference of the Gay Academic Union in the fall of 1973. Some of us formed a CR group, and as we grew closer to each other, we began to focus on our need to collect and preserve our own voices, the voices of our lesbian community. As our contribution to our community, we decided to undertake the collecting, preserving, and making available to our sisters all the prints of our existence. We undertook the archives not as a short-term project, but as a commitment to rediscovering our past, controlling our present, and speaking to our future. We seek to preserve for the future all expressions of our identity, written, spoken, drawn, filmed, photographed, recorded. The one thing you notice, there's never any mention of how we're going to raise money, because we never raised it. The apartment lived in my apartment, so I paid the rent. We all tithed ourselves. Those of us who had jobs. It was a time when if something was missing, you created it. And I'll always treasure that grassroots impulse. Our statement of purpose. The Lesbian Herstory Archives exist to gather and preserve records of lesbian life and activities so that future generations of lesbians will have ready access to materials relevant to their lives. The process of gathering this material will also serve to uncover and collect our herstory, denied to us previously by patriarchal historians in the interests of the culture which they serve. The existence of these archives will enable us to analyze and reevaluate the lesbian experience. The archives will be run as a lesbian collective, and it still is, and decisions will be made by consensus. All lesbian women must have access to the archives. No academic, political, or sexual credentials are required to use the collection. Race and class must be no barrier for use of or inclusion in the archives. The archives is housed within the lesbian community, curated and maintained by lesbians. The collection or parts of it will not be sold to a public or private mainstream institution that is by definition closed to many women. The archives is funded by individual lesbians, progressive peoples of all kinds, and radical funding sources rather than by government funds. The archives is committed to the liberation struggle of all lesbian peoples. The archives is dedicated to building intergenerational bridges between lesbian communities, to deepening the understanding of what the lesbian experience meant in different historical settings. In an attempt to demystify the archival process, archival skills will be taught one generation of lesbians to another. The archives is a people's refusal to be forced out of their collective memory. Okay, end of that now. From 1974 to 1992, the archives collection grew from a coffee can bookcase, which you have seen, and one file drawer in a small back room to fill all 6 rooms of my Upper West Side apartment, even my bedroom, which became the audio-visual room. And that led to many funny stories. But there was a lot of action in the bedroom. Okay. My whole journey with LHA allowed me to explore the misty border between the private and the public, a tension that is still compelling to me. As a femme who came from the freak times, when we risked all to ensure that we had some public air to breathe, the bars, the beaches. My home was a public gathering place for those who needed information, solace, material for creation, connections of all kinds, planning political actions as well as films, books, theater. The archival space, it now seems to me, is that place where the private becomes a public shadow, the place of uncontained conversations. In 1991, the collective started a campaign to raise money to buy the archives its own home in Park Slope, Brooklyn. For almost 20 years, our communities had grown to trust this undertaking, both in America and internationally, and support poured in small amounts, but so many. And in 1993, we opened LHA in its new home, and there you can find it today. Now, is anybody there have been to the Lesbian Herstory Archives in Brooklyn? Yay! So you know it really exists, right? Okay, now I just switch. I hope I'm not boring you. Okay, I can't. I'm so used to having my body be in the room that I'm finding, I'm looking hard into your eyes, and I hope the woman who was coughing isn't getting a bad cold, and I want you to know that I'm taking you all in. Okay. Now, for many years of my teaching life, I lived with the work of Frederick Douglass. And this is a mixture of show and tell, but I don't know if you can see this because this is really important. It's the different texts that feed into archival thinking, at least my archival thinking. I lived with the work of Frederick Douglass, particularly his narrative, The Life of an American Slave, published in 1845, reading over and over his lines of emancipatory discovery. Speaking of his slave master, Douglass wrote, "What he most dreaded, that I most desired. What he most loved, that I most hated. That which to him was a great evil to be carefully shunned, was to me a great good to be diligently sought." The end of that quote. This is what I call the glory and complexity of the counter-narrative, the gift of the archives, or the alchemy of desire that changes pathology to life. From a conversation around the Lesbian Herstory Archives dinner work table, 1979, the speaker, a Jewish woman in her 60s, says, "I had a chance to read The Well of Loneliness that had been translated into Polish before I was taken into the camps. I was a young girl at the time, around 12 or 13, and one of the ways I survived in the camp was by remembering that book. I wanted to live long enough to kiss a woman." In the archives, for me, there's always the wonder of counter-narrative, where insult is turned into hope. And my next example is the voice of Mabel Hampton, and Carl will show you some slides as I read this. Speaking of, I can see the top of his head in his. Okay. She's speaking of what it meant for her, okay, to attend the play The Captive in 1929 on Broadway before the police arrested its leading lady and padlocked the doors of the theater on obscenity charges. I want to highlight the counter-narratives embedded in what seemed one national story, one nation. So this is from the New York Times, The Nation, September 30th, 1926, talking about this play. The tragedy of a young woman well-bred from a good family who falls into a twisted relationship with another woman. For nearly half this play, this loathsome possibility, never mentioned, scarcely hinted at, hangs over the drama like a black pall, a prescience of impending doom, a revolting theme, end quote. And then there are letters published along with it from a reader described only as a mother, quote, perversion is a horror and a smallpox that should be treated in the segregation of the pest house laboratory, the national story. Then the privilege of hearing Miss Hampton's lived historical experience, which I had the privilege of taping for the archives. So, and I have Mabel's voice in my ear. So well, I heard about it, and a girlfriend of mine had taken me to see this play, The Captive, and I fell in love, not only with The Captive, but the lady who was the head actress in it. Her name was Helen Mencken. So I decided to go back. I heard so much talk about it. I went back to see it by myself. I sat on the edge of my seat. I looked at the first part, and I will always think that woman was a lesbian. She played it too perfect. She had the thing down. She kissed too perfect. She had everything down pat. So that's why I kept going back to see it, because it looked like to me it was part of my life. I was a young woman, and I said, now this is what I would like to be. Now, in this play I'm taking, the two women are both married. So Mabel says, but of course I would have to marry, and I didn't want to. So I would just go on and do what was right for me. I talked to a couple of my friends in Jersey City about the play. I carried them back and paid their way to see it, and they fell in love with it. There was plenty of women in that audience and plenty of men too, and by that she means same-sex couples, so this is going back to the 1920s of the gay audience. They applauded and applauded. This same girl with the green car, she knew her Helen Mencken, and she carried me backstage and introduced me. Boy, I felt so proud. And she says, why do you like the show? I said, because it seems a part of my life and what I am and hope to be. She says, that's nice, stick to it, you'll be all right. Miss Hampton told me the story when she was in her 70s, as I am now telling you this story. And the relish of this life-giving experience still clung to her words. Yes, why I worked with the archives. My mission was to hold at bay the lesbian feminist preconceived judgment of the butch femme community that had given me life. But what I was also doing was documenting lives that nations delighted in insulting, carrying with me moments of invincible spirit, revolts of the body and its desires, moving beyond what was imagined. In the full light of lesbian feminism, I brought back shadows, or what Sheila Jeffries has said, lesbian decadence. She wasn't happy about that. With these images, I was revolting against ordained absences, against historical positions of the good and the bad. I had to people and give voice to the other country. The Lesbian Herstory Archives allowed me to compose exchanges between the times of insult and the times of liberation, not just in reverence for the New World, but in wonder at the complexity and nuances of stances of resistance in the old. The images which you saw as you walked into the room were the visible form of that conversation. What these bodies have taught me: to question orthodoxies nationally and sometimes within our own communities, to refuse the allotted places, to move into unknown waters, to take on huge states of no with comrades on either side, to collectively say yes to previously unthought of equities, to take pleasure in new decipherings of old conversations, to compose homes in exile, to listen to the songs of the exiled who perhaps need another kind of body, to look always for national absence. I offer the images you saw this afternoon not as moments of unified identity, but as moments of complex gender and sexual stances, as moments of mystery, of historical play and sincerities. I offer them for encouragement of our imaginations in this time of hardened national rhetoric, and in a time marked by many of us by our own longings for national respectability. For me now, I know archives contain no final words. They are not a place where the stillness of history gathers, but where vendettas are waged, love affairs begun and ended, and where the refused are stubbornly present. The archives must always be an uncleansed country. Thanks. That's it, Carl. Oh, my kids. I can talk. And I look. Okay, questions?
Is the archive still paid voluntarily? No state, no still?
Yes, the archives is still an all-volunteer organization. It still doesn't take money from the government, but you know, of course, that's, we don't get grants, but like we get a tax deductible, so in a way. But yes, and what I would like to say, you see how many times the words, it was a lesbian-centric project, and for me, now we're all different on the collective, right? So I come from my background, others came out in the 80s. There's so many different histories. To me, the word lesbian always meant for the archives to be inclusive of bi, trans, sex workers. So I see the word lesbian, or as, because I came out in the queer freak times, as I call it, as large enough to cover everything. It makes for interesting conversation around our table.
I have a question.
Yes.
How is the archive organized? Is it organized around different eras, like the 50s and 60s, or is it by type of media, or?
It's all, okay. When we started, none of us who started, that was Deborah and I and others, we're the longest ongoing participants, were trained librarians. I've never, or archivists, and now we have many who work with us. But it's all, okay, here's the first thing. It's an artifact itself, the archives, right? It's from the 70s, you could hear the language. So how are each genre in each part of the collection has its own organization. Some of them make perfect sense and follow the traditional, but like our book collection, we file books under the woman's first name. Now that's a legacy from the 70s when the last name was seen as patriarchal. And we'll keep that. It drives people crazy, but we will keep it. But as I said, you know, remember, we started before digitization. We had a funny little clanky old computer, you know. But coming to that building, we're really entering a grassroots, lesbian movement, people's movement, progressive movement. The whole building itself is an artifact. And I'm one of the oldest artifacts that's part of it. I'm an artifact. So to answer your question, so we have everything. We're a museum. We have fabric. We have tapes. We have old LPs. We have volunteers and who organize it all, and we have a website, which and we're putting more and more of our collection is being digitized and made possible. We've also have libraries. People have come in and scanned like our newspaper collection. So it's organized in a sensible way. In other words, if you went, they also have guides to help you. It's just the book collection that's a little odd. And we're moving to sort of where everything will be on one catalog, computer catalog. But it's always an ongoing process. You will always see work going on at the archives. I used to feel bad about that, but I'll tell you a story. When Deb and I were starting this process, we knew we were undereducated. Passion will take you just so far, So, and acid does it, acid-free materials. So, Deb and I went across the country doing sort of, infiltrating formal archives to try to learn. And we even got to see the back rooms of the Library of Congress because we were feeling guilty because we had all these boxes that still needed to be inventories. And sure enough, the Library of Congress has a backlog of what looks like 50 years. So, but we learned, we found a mother pop little company that sold archival materials in New York City. We learned. And now, we help other archives, formal archives, I don't know what the word, whereas, how can I put this, we're as professional as a grassroots political legacied archives can be. So money is always an issue for us. I want to say one other thing. No one's asked me this question, but it's important to me. The one danger in doing, there's this whole new activist archives, that whole thing is the creation of a role model archives. Never wanted the Lesbian Herstory Archives to be a role model archives. And what do I mean by that? It couldn't serve the future, and now it is the future, if we cleaned up the history. So women would come and say, oh, but you shouldn't collect S&M, lesbian S&M, and you shouldn't have butch femme images. And one woman said to me, well, if there was a Nazi lesbian group, would you collect it? And I said, certainly. So it's you're a liberatory undertaking. But that all depends on one's definition of what constitutes liberation. And for me to be tied to any preconceived, to be tied to the arrogance that we know what queer women and others, because the archives is open to all to use it, will need in the future is an arrogance I could never pay into. And since my own mother was a sex worker from time to time, I demanded that sex workers, and many of whom are lesbians, to be in the archives. So I know it's really important to me that our archives are not about telling only the good stories or those that make us feel good, because we're way beyond that. And in fact, one of the most important collections in the archives is of an FBI lesbian informer. We have the papers of the FBI surveillance on lesbian groups, but it also works the other way, and I think that is crucial. That is crucial. Some more personal collections. Di, why don't you come here? No, I'm not. My partner's in the back, my lover, and she's saying, why don't you do this? And on her... she's in her pajamas. She's in her Qantas pajamas. She's Australian, that's why I'm... Don't be shy.
In that case, you mean that the archive is going to continue as long as people archives continues to archive?
Yes. In fact, it's more lively than ever in Brooklyn. If you're ever in Brooklyn, New York, or if you're in New York, I didn't give you the website address, but you just have to type in Lesbian Herstory Archives and you'll find it. And it has a whole new generation of younger women. Yes, it's doing wonderfully, and still in this old-fashioned, clunky way, without writing big proposals for money, and it just does what it needs to do. And it's a resource center. It's a collection. It's a place where women meet all the time. What about your own lives? Have you given markings of your lives to archives? Yes.
I have a question. Thank you very much for this wonderful story about your archive, and really wonderful to listen to you. Thank you also for carrying my coat, because I was the one I'm the coffee one.
Yes, I know.
I just want to, I guess that all these stories and these pictures and these films from these books and journals and everything has been brought to you by people, by activists or people living in this community. But I also want to ask you if you look back into history, trying to get new material from all the time. I'm not an artist, I'm an historian, so this question interests me a lot.
We have, yes, we don't have our own researchers, okay? What we do is put the word out and things will come to us. Now, when we started, it was easier because there were women in their 60s and 70s who were bringing their things. And I remember one of the oldest things we have is it's a facsimile. I think at one point, I think we have the original newspaper of, I think it was in the 1800s, a newspaper with an article on the ladies of Llangollen, who were a lesbian couple living. But as we discover things, as it comes to us through donations. But like, we just have one of the women who works with the archives, who's in her 80s. Her gay sister was a medic in the Vietnam War, and she was a lesbian woman. She donated her uniform with her medic thing, and now Teddy has just donated all her photographs. So things are always coming in, you know. And people who work with the archives or have their own lives and they can do their own work. But I don't know if I'm answering your question, but you're right. We don't go out and search, and I don't anymore. I don't do the same oral history as I used to do because I'm here now. But people know of our work and bring us things. And by the way, we're an international archives, and we're not a national archives. That's another thing we haven't talked about. But we used to say, one of the parts of the archives was giving tours. I cannot tell you of my apartment how many tours I've given out. And it would be hysterical because I'd pretend like, okay, the bus is leaving now, you know, and we'd go from the dining room to the bedroom but now I just forgot why I was saying that. But we used to say on tour because we had some of our first visitors were visitors from what I would call, it being an American then, overseas, and we'd say, send us something in the language you make love in. It was very important to me, and I speak myself because all the women as part of the collective have different, again, politics and histories. That the body be represented. We have a collection of lesbian erotica. I don't know if you know about my writing, but some people have called me a pornographer. I believe that our bodies must be present in our history of the past. So women have sent images of themselves making love. You know, the work of T. Corinne. We've encouraged people to document passion. So, yes.
Can I
Yes.
ask you about your writing? Because I really love a lot of your essay collections. Do you still write? You said that you don't collect as much as you're in Melbourne, but are you writing on something?
Yes, and in fact, okay, I have a blog, which I'm almost embarrassed to say it, but I've been writing a lot. It's called Don't You Ever Stop Talking. And so, yes, in fact, I'm going to do it as, I think, a self-published book because it's political and nobody will publish it, but I would like it to be out there. And I'm also working now, so I write short stories still. I'm working on a history of the archives because the apartment it was in was 13A. So I don't know, I don't imagine anyone there was in that apartment, but there are still some people who are. So it's called 13A, the story of an apartment, a community, and an idea from 1974 to 1992. So that's the biggest thing that'll be my serious thing. But I'm active in many ways through my writing and many politics that I believe in, like the anti-occupation. He is of Israel, the anti-occupation by Israel of Palestine. So I use my writing always, as you saw, into the service of my emancipatory dream, the dream of freedom from national bullying. And I don't know about you, but I am really concerned what's happening with the rise of the right wing and the role some gay people play in it. In America, in Europe, all over the world now. I want to thank you so much for making all of this possible.
Yeah, thank you. Any more questions? I think it's about time to end this. Thank you so much for doing this, Joan. It was amazing to listen to you and very inspiring.
Thank you. It's hard to push this red button, the red phone that says goodbye. What a miracle this is, from Australia to Gothenburg. Okay, goodbye, bye-bye.